paranormal is real. Listen. Hi, I'm Traci.
And I'm Kathy.
And this is Curious Explorers. Hi, Kathy.
Hey, Traci. How are you?
So good to see you.
I know. I feel like it's been forever.
I know. And you can't really see well, but I'm wearing one of my many Halloween outfits I bought for the pod, because around here it's Halloween
I'm wearing a T-shirt from New Orleans, which is one of the most haunted cities. So it's kind of on point.
I love it. We will have to do an investigation there, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely. So yeah, tell me a little bit about what you've been up to. Tell our listeners what you've been up to, because I'm sure it's super cool.
So, this is always a very hectic time of year at Paranormal. But it's also one of those times of year that I get to do things that I really want to do. I wish I could spread them out throughout the year, but you kind of have to do things when they become available to you. But I was up in Salem, Massachusetts, not last weekend, the weekend before, and I did an investigation at the Old Town Hall in Salem. And for those of you who have watched Hocus Pocus, it is the building that the big party was purported to have taken place in. So they actually shot the exteriors at that building, but the interiors were shot in California. But it is a historic building. It was built in, I think, 1834, and it was built on the footprint of an earlier building that was there. And it's an impressively old building in an incredibly historic place. I don't know that anyone has ever investigated there before, but I was able to go in there with Adam Berry from Ghost Hunters and Kindred Spirits, and a relatively small group of people. And we did kind of an investigative seance versus a full investigation. It was really interesting.
Just clarify for me and anyone listening what an investigative seance is.
So, and I kind of just coined that. But a lot of times when you're doing an investigation and you do a paranormal investigation, it's you're going into locations and you're essentially just waiting around for phenomena to happen, and you're bringing in different types of equipment, and you might be waiting for some kind of psychic phenomena to happen, but you do have equipment. You're in a small group, you're in a specific location, and you're probably somewhat familiar with activity that people have had. So you're trying to replicate that, or you're trying to at least capture that so that you can either explain it or validate it as paranormal in nature. And sometimes the explanation is that it was paranormal in nature. In this, it was a bit more, and a seance, the word just means sitting. So in the way that we use it colloquially or the way that we use it and understand it, is that it's a group of like-minded people sitting and attempting to communicate with the dead. And I would say we did kind of a hybrid of that, because we sat in a large group, but not a massive group. We didn't do a ton of investigation. We didn't do a ton of walking around with equipment and going into different locations. We sat in a central location with a couple of types of equipment that would allow for easier communication, and just essentially asked questions to the ether to see whether or not we were getting responses. We used something called a tripwire, and we used Adam has a lot of equipment. I have a lot of equipment too, but you tend to lean in on the things that you're familiar with, and you tend to lean in on the things that you get results with. And so Adam uses a tripwire. A tripwire is a large or a long wire that has lights that are individual EMF detectors. So if you think of like the big old school Christmas lights, where they stretch out and there's maybe 3 or 4 feet between lights, each one of those individual lights would be an individual EMF detector. So if there's EMF detected in a very specific area, 3-foot area, one light would light up. And so the reason why that's compelling is because you can communicate and say, light this specific one up, or light them up in turn, or turn off that one light, which is much more impressive than, say, all of the lights going on at once, which is much more likely that it would be environmental. And Adam uses a Frank's box, so we used a Frank's box as well. And he has one of the original ones. I think Frank Sumption made 86 of them, and I think Adam has like number 64. And we used the Estes method, but it was very much conversational. So as opposed to, breaking up into little groups and going to our individual areas, we tried to use the collective energy of the group to make connection. And I would say that we were fairly successful in doing so. It was interesting.
I love it, and I really wanna come up with you sometime. It's just been crazy busy here, but I really wanna go do that with you and Adam sometime, and I'm really excited to go to Salem, so we'll have to make another trip.
Oh, and there's always something to do in Salem, and we already talked about what we're gonna do there next, but, the following week, I was able to go up and do an investigation in Provincetown, at a location, at a very small location, and, I mean, it's after Halloween, so it's not the crazy time, and so you can kind of have a little bit more quiet. Um, but I am glad to be home, though. It was a lot of driving for a couple of weeks, so I am glad to be home.
Oh, I'm sure. And again, it really is great to see you. I'm very curious, no pun intended, about what you have in store for us today. I'm very
So
curious about what you have planned.
so I went back and forth on which to do. I actually chose this because I thought it kind of tied in with you a little bit.
Ooh,
But I will say I was inspired by the investigation to start to research another subject, which I will do. I'll do at a later date for us because I want to do a little bit more research on it. But I decided to present the Bridey Murphy case today. So I don't
oh,
know if you're
great.
familiar with it. It's kind of a
I am
well-known,
somewhat,
yeah.
somewhat, but I want to hear your take on it.
So, the Bridey Murphy case is one of those tried and true. It's one of the old school paranormal cases from the mid 20th century. And I would say it's a high watermark case, meaning that it's one of those cases that became very, very popular. I don't think it ever was fully explained. I never really like to use the word debunked because that the implication is that it was bunk in the first place. And to me, bunk is something that's an intentional misleading, and I don't think that even remotely comes into play here. Um, but it was one of those cases that inspired people from lots of different walks of life to kind of look at the phenomena of reincarnation, and paranormal in general, and look at it and say maybe there's more to this than what we had thought before. And it's an interesting case. So if you're a paranormalist, you're probably familiar with this. If you're not a paranormalist or you're just getting into it, it's definitely something that I think even if I present the most comprehensive even if I talk about this comprehensively, there's still so much more for you to dive into. So I think it's a good it's a good old school case.
I love
Um,
it.
so Bridey Murphy, it's one of the most intriguing and I would say controversial cases of paranormal phenomena, specifically of past life regression and specifically of reincarnation. It involves the claims of a woman who claimed to have lived a past life in 19th century Ireland. I do have to say, a lot of people claim to be Irish, especially in the mid 20th century. A lot of people who came forward with feelings of having lived before, claimed to have felt that they were Irish or were in Ireland, and maybe that's because 100 years before you had a massive exodus from Ireland because of the potato famine. But
Can I,
you know,
can I ask you a quick question about
yeah.
that? Because, tell me if I get this wrong. I am not Irish, disclosure, but I would not think of Irish people in Ireland as being big believers in reincarnation. So it would be, because I would think that's a Catholic Church not into that type of thing?
Yeah, I
Tell
mean,
me
I
if I get
don't
it
think
wrong.
that. Yeah, I mean, but I would say that the people who are
So it's even
claiming it
more
are not
intriguing
necessarily Irish, right? They're just claiming that their past lives were in
that they
Ireland.
were.
Yeah, that they
Okay.
were Irish.
Okay.
But yeah,
Interesting.
I will say this. I think country Irish are very superstitious in nature, so they believe very much in the supernatural. They may not believe in it in the way that they're interested in it, maybe a little bit more that they're afraid of it. But I would agree with you that reincarnation is definitely not something that would fall into a belief, an interest. It's not something that they would secretly believe in, and and then not, and largely because virtually everybody in Ireland, or certainly in the South of Ireland, what we would call the Republic of Ireland, would be Roman Catholic. I mean, there's obviously Protestants in Ireland, but the vast majority of people were Roman Catholics, and that's not. I don't. And a lot of them would have been uneducated, so even so, their belief system wouldn't have included it because they wouldn't have had knowledge of it. It wouldn't have been something
Okay.
that came up. But this woman actually lived in the United States. Um, she she claimed to have lived a past life in 19th century Ireland, which honestly would not be a terrific place to live, or a terrific time to live. Her name, she lived in Colorado. Her name was Virginia Tighe. And her experiences started in the early 1950s. She was an American housewife. Like I said, she lived in Denver, Colorado. She claimed to have gone through a series of past life regression sessions using hypnosis. And in that, she purportedly not only did she become aware of another personality or a past personality, but she claimed to have almost relived the experience. So these past life regressions were very, very prolific, and they were prolonged, and they caused not just a memory, but an experience of actually reliving that life. And she claimed to live the life of a woman named Bridey Murphy. Now, Bridey is a very common Irish name. Murphy is obviously a very common Irish name. Bridey is a shortened version of Bridget. And so there were lots of Bridgets. There were lots of Brideys. I can think of 5 Brideys off the top of my head right now that I know. So in Ireland, even today, it's like a Mary. It's very common. Murphy's obviously a very common name as well. According to Tighe, Bridey Murphy was an Irish woman. She lived in the 19th century. She had a series of experiences that Tighe was able to describe in detail in her hypnotic regressions. Her claims, now obviously these hypnotic regressions took place privately, and they took place under the guidance of a doctor, and so this information was not something that should have been particularly widely known unless both she and the doctor decided that they would be. And her doctor was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Joseph E. Smith. He conducted the hypnotic regression sessions. She was able to provide detailed accounts of Bridey Murphy's life, including specific locations, names, events, dates, all of these things that supposedly took place in 19th century Ireland. The story became well known because Dr. Smith became convinced that this was evidence of past life, and was believed that this was a case that was almost unassailable. Right, there was so much information came through. It was so detailed that he felt that this was the case to kind of come forward and say, we had a feeling that this was going on. This seems to be, if not proof, certainly very, very strong evidence. It gained widespread attention when he published a book called The Search for Bridey Murphy, which I can straight up tell you I sell. It's still in publication. People still buy it. It's still on the shelves. It was published in 1956, and it was written by Maury Bernstein, who was a Denver businessman. And you probably know him. He wrote a couple of other paranormal books, titles as well. None of them as popular as this book. But he had also conducted hypnosis sessions with Tighe. The book details the regressions and information uncovered about Murphy's past life. It was a bestseller. It played a significant role in popularizing the case, but it also played a big role in kind of drawing the attention of both the public's attention and the scientific community's attention to paranormal in a broad sense, but very specifically the use of hypnosis for past life regression, the idea of past life regression, and reincarnation. So, according to Bernstein, during the hypnotic regression sessions, Tighe provided detailed descriptions of Murphy's life. According to Tighe, Bridey was born in the early 19th century in a small village in Ireland. Tighe described Bridey's family, her marriage, and her life experiences, including specific details about Irish customs, dialect. In other words, she spoke as Bridey Murphy, so she spoke in a very specific dialect. And if you know anything about Ireland, you know, Irish dialects, especially in the 18th and 19th century, could change within a 10 or 12 or 15-mile radius. So, for instance, my mother and my father were born and raised 4 miles apart. My mother's brogue is very, very different from what my father's brogue was. My father had a very strong accent. My mother had a little bit more of a lilting kind of, the one that kind of a Hollywood style Irish brogue. But my father had a very strong, I would say a lot of people would find him difficult to understand. And also talked about the geography of the area that Murphy lived. And remember, she's not referring to Murphy in these sessions. She is Murphy in these sessions. So when she's presenting this stuff, this is her home, her geography, her dialect, her family. One of the most striking claims was that Tighe gave a detailed description of Bridey Murphy's home, including its layout and furnishings. In fact, she drew a diagram. Tighe also spoke about Bridey's experiences with local people, her interactions, and she did speak about her eventual death. So she talked about people in the village, she talked about experiences that she had with them, and then she also described her death. The accounts were extremely detailed, and they seemed to align with historical and cultural information that was known about 19th century Ireland. Some of it was broad, but some of it seemed to be very, very specific. And the details were specific, but then they start to run into a little bit of difficulty when they're trying to verify these things, as one might expect. I mean, 18th and 19th century Ireland was not, it didn't have a database. Most of the records would have been church records, and there would have been very few records with regard to interactions between neighbors. Most people got on the record at birth and the next reference was either when they got married or they died. So there wasn't a whole lot of, and you're not dealing with a literate society as well. So even the letters might have been very, very difficult to kind of pinpoint. And you're also talking about a time period when there was massive immigration out of the country because of the potato famine, and you have a poverty-stricken population. So Bernstein, the book became profoundly popular. Bernstein and other people in the scientific community attempted to verify. I will say, after the book was published, attempted to verify the information that was provided by Tighe. They conducted investigations to locate the specific village. Irish villages were geographically named, or they were named generally, or they were named according to some kind of religious, right? So you might have a St. Catherine's, but you might also have a place like Ballinlass, and Ballinlass would be like, village by the bridge. It might be something that, and don't at me. I know Ballinlass doesn't mean that. Not you, Traci, but anybody else. I know Ballinlass doesn't mean that.
I'll take your word for it. I have no idea.
It's usually descriptive, right? So you might have a village that means bend of the river, and it would be the Gaelic word for bend of the river. But it would be named geographically and not necessarily named. So you would have a lot of those places, right? So if you're naming a place, near the bridge, probably there's lots of places that were near the bridge, right? So they did try. Bernstein actually claimed to have found the village or at least a village that very much matched the description provided by Tighe. And although the exact details to this day, there certainly were things that seemed to align, but there were definitely things that could be open to debate. Um, uh, you can imagine that the Bridey Murphy case attracted a lot of skepticism from the scientific community, and also from paranormal investigators. Critics questioned the validity of the claims. They argued that they could be explained by other factors, such as, and this is interesting because this is going to come up in a couple of other cases. And it's something that we might think of as obvious, but I don't think just because it's obvious, it's necessarily correct. But such as subconscious knowledge or the influence of external sources. So in other words, maybe she read a book about Ireland. Maybe she read a book when she was 12 years old and all of this information was available, and she just spontaneously she incorporated it into her subconscious, and then during the past life regression it came out. That's an argument that's made in a lot of things.
Could you learn a brogue from could you learn a local dialect
she
from
might
a
have watched
book?
Darby O'Gillis, you know what I mean? She might have watched a movie or something. But the argument is that the information that she claims to not have knowledge of could have been gleaned subconsciously from other things. And of course we know that that's true, right? So but just because she may have seen a movie about a place in Ireland and forgotten about it doesn't seem to me to sufficiently explain the level of detail that she was able to achieve. It's something that's gonna come up in another case that I'll reference here as a teaser, but the Patience Worth case, you'll see that as well in that. And it's something that, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this up with you, because the major criticism was the possibility of cryptomnesia. And this is where individuals unknowingly recall information that they've encountered other places, they've absorbed essentially through their daily lives, but they're not consciously aware that they know of it. And that could be something like, sometimes you see words in Latin. It doesn't mean you know Latin, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I kind of know what that word means because you've seen it repetitively. It doesn't mean that, you suddenly are a pope from the 12th century. It just means that we're constantly absorbing and gathering information. And I would say, I absolutely believe that that's true. We know that happens. Again, I'm not sure that it's a full explanation for this. Skeptics also argued that Tighe may have absorbed, information about Ireland through lots of different media. Movies were popular. Maureen O'Hara, The Quiet Man had been, I don't know, maybe it hadn't been released yet, but she might have pulled those things in. And this is where I kind of started to get interested in this, is that it caused people to start looking at the examination of the techniques in hypnosis, right? So some of the criticism actually looked at the techniques that had been used in the hypnotic sessions, with some experts arguing that the methods employed were leading. In other words, the questions might have led to these things, and also that the process, and it's not clear that this happened, but there was a suggestion that people thought it had happened, which was that during the hypnotic procedure itself, there was external suggestions that were incorporated or information made available that essentially informed the responses that they got. Psychologists and sociologists also looked at the cultural and psychological factors that might have influenced Tighe. In the mid 20th century, it was a period of like the 1860s and the 19 teens and the 1950s. People were interested in the paranormal, and I call this the Reader's Digest paranormal era, where you had a large group of people who were in the middle class who had leisure time, and there were mass publications that were exploring these things on an entertainment level. right? So you had Life magazine did a huge spread on Borley Rectory. It was it was intriguing, and it was done to be intriguing. And then you had Reader's Digest, and they would constantly be kind of these were titillating things. And you had pulp magazines, and so this is one of those things where it's like, because people became interested, they became misled, or I'm not. This is a little bit of chasing a tail, as far as I'm concerned. But in other words, because she was interested in the paranormal, it led to her having this paranormal experience, which of course is kind of a backwards way of saying she made it up, even if it was subconscious. But it did spark a reincarnation debate. So the case itself was interesting. The subjects in the case were interesting, but it did start to create there were broader implications. Number one, because the book was a massive bestseller. It was a huge bestseller. And I do think that it actually got cut up into serial pieces that were republished as part of Reader's Digest and part of other things. So if you didn't buy the book, there were excerpts that were available to you. So you did have it, even though I think there was almost 1 million copies sold. So even if you were not one of the people that bought the 1 million copies, you could have consumed this in the Sunday newspaper. When I was a kid, there was the Parade magazine that came in the newspaper, and they always had excerpts. This is just around the time that Jean Dixon is becoming popular too. So you really have people talking about this stuff. And so you had people who believed in reincarnation saw this as an aha moment, and also she was an interesting person, because she was a regular person that this was happening to. She wasn't Uri Geller bending spoons, and she wasn't a person that was doing this for a living. And we'll probably do an episode on Uri Geller at some point. So
we absolutely should, because I know people who know him personally and have
and
seen
he's
him
still
work.
accessible, right? He's still very accessible.
Yes, and controversial.
It did prompt a critical examination of the methods and also of the ethics of using hypnosis to explore past lives. And the case underscored the need for rigorous standards, safeguards in hypnotic practices. I'm sure there's lots of reasons why there should be, I'm sure there's lots of reasons to make sure that we're maintaining rigid standards, and not just that someone might have a past life experience, so the implication that you have to be particularly, vigilant lest someone have a paranormal experience is kind of coloring the idea that a paranormal experience is fraudulent or not true. But it did make people start looking at hypnosis and saying, we need to kind of look at this and make sure that we're controlling the environment and we're controlling the procedures. So it did have implications for not just people who are practicing hypnosis, but people who are practicing lots of different types of therapeutic methodologies. And the popularity also led to people becoming more interested in hypnosis as a method of learning more about themselves, specifically about past lives, but not only past lives. And so because it became very popular, it became very important that hypnosis started to be looked at as something that needed to be procedural, that there needed to be certain procedures that were in place. So, and despite the fact that there was lots of criticism, despite the fact that there was controversies, the Bridey Murphy case is still interesting to researchers. I still find it very interesting. I have read the book, and I still find it very compelling. Scholars, investigators continue to look at the case. And one of the reasons is that the evidence is there. There is a book, right? The evidence is there. There are the records. There are the notes. Even though all the people who were involved in it have passed away, they did leave behind, records. And we don't have that in a lot of cases. So it's good to, and they had to defend themselves at the time. And they did defend themselves. not, they weren't attacked for it, but they did attempt to present this as forensically as possible. I don't think any of the people involved in this looked at this and said, wow, this is a way for us to sell books. I think they looked at this and said, wow, I think we have something here. It also led to lots of different discussions on memories, consciousness, not just for past life, but for contemporary life with past memories, things that get lost in our consciousness and slip into our subconscious, and how it influences and how it affects us. I would say, the Bridey Murphy case has influenced every subsequent past life regression case. I think that and reincarnation. And I know we're using those words interchangeably, but they are different things. So past life regression is the procedure, and reincarnation is the subject. Reincarnation is what's occurring, and past life regression is one of the methodologies to get to that, right? Get to evidence of that. So it was the Bridey Murphy case was an incredibly important kind of zeitgeist moment, where you had the popularity of the subject matter led to lots of different groups of people in being interested in the subject matter. It also led to kind of a serious look at the experiences that this woman was having, but that it ultimately also led to people wanting to have that experience. So it wasn't just that you had this spontaneous, this spontaneous response, or the spontaneous episode where this thing happened. And remember, she was regressed many times, but it led to people saying, wait, maybe I can do that too. Maybe there's something within me that I can pull out of. So I think the case is very interesting. I think it's always going to be debated. I think that it is complex. I also think under no circumstances on either side can someone claim that this is fraudulent. It's either a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding of the information that came through, or it is very powerful evidence of reincarnation, or at least the survival on some level of past memories from other lives. So whether that is a life that the individual lived, or some kind of collective memory that is, genetically encoded into someone, is open to debate, but it's still a really important case.
Oh, it is. And, Kathy, I remember reading about this a million years ago. I've written a bunch of little notes as you were talking, because you brought up some really important things about the case and about the larger field in general. And you kind of hinted at this. One, memory is an interesting thing, right? And I don't think we can hold past life memory to a higher standard than current life memory. And we
Mhm.
know that if you asked a person to recall what they did last week, it will not be 100% accurate. And forget
Right.
about decades ago, right? There are all kinds of things we just don't encode well. The other thing is, you kind of alluded to this as well, the geography in terms of like what a place looks like, the names of towns, the culture of a place, the way records are kept. All of that is subject to change over time, to the point that it wouldn't be verifiable in its originally reported form, especially like you're saying in an area that's rural,
Mhm.
or where record keeping wasn't terrific at a time when, obviously that was the case. Clearly in the 1950s, this woman wasn't using a non-existent internet. People didn't
Right.
really have access to the same amount of information. These are reasons why I think the case is still very compelling. If you look at Ian Stevenson's cases, from the University of Virginia, they're so well documented.
Right.
And if you read through the transcripts of these interviews and the summaries of these cases, there's not a single one where recall is perfect. And yet there are details that are mind blowing and would not be possible for someone to have known
Right.
about the life they were recalling,
Well, I
other
mean,
than
and Stevenson's, work is I think uniquely important, mainly because um he is a Western he's a Western researcher who is going into a community that does have a profound belief
Yes.
in reincarnation, and I think you can make the argument that the belief in reincarnation makes it easier for someone to come forward with evidence of
Oh,
reincarnation,
yeah.
because you're going to be it's going to be a lot more welcomed. It's not going to be scrutinized or completely doubted by your local
Ridiculed.
community. But also, um, I mean, Stevenson's work is one of the things that's compelling about it is the amount of it. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
he has case upon case upon case upon case upon case. And I think the people that followed him, a lot of them were from the community that he was working with. And and unfortunately, I think their being a part of that community has led to their take on it being less kind of like compelling for Western researchers. But I think that you're right. I think that when you look at I I think people look at cases like reincarnation as miraculous, right? Or they associate them, or they look at them the same way they look at miracles, right? But if if reincarnation exists, it is very common, right? It's not miraculous. It's not utterly unique. And so when they look at saying, well, in order for this to be proof of reincarnation, it needs to be held to this profound level of proof. And I think that you're right. It's not going to be. It's not a hard drive that is being read from.
Yeah.
It's not a book that's being opened. It's not a recording on it's someone's memory. And it's going to
Which can be very
be
polluted.
and it's going to be as likely. Listen, I can't remember where I put my keys. I walked into this room an hour ago. So um the idea that you would have total recall, after pushing it down, or having that memory be um hidden within the synapses of your memory. I don't necessarily think that that's proof that it's not true. And I know you can't prove a
Agreed.
negative, but I don't necessarily think that it's a knock on the and again, in cases like this, it's the preponderance of evidence that has to win out. So if you say, well, she said 15 things, right? And 8 of those things were right. Well, that's 50-50. But 12 of those things were right. That's far more than 50-50, right? So the preponderance of evidence is that she is probably beyond it's probably statistically proven that, her accuracy is greater than it is not, right?
Let me tell you something. I'm in the information age, along with you and everybody listening, and I couldn't get 3 things out of 100 correct about an Irish village. And I'm
Right.
just so the fact that somebody in the 50s with no internet could get
Right.
those specific things, like, it's not even the amount that, it's just like, what's the likelihood that someone, and I can't do an Irish brogue. So
I'm going to say this. I'm
I'm
going to
very
recommend that
impressed.
people read the book, though,
Yeah.
because, us talking about it, because even casually, you can say, well, I could come up with 10 Irish names. I'm sure there was a Brendan. I'm sure there was a Michael. I'm sure there was a Thomas. I'm sure that, you could. I'm sure that you could come up. So it's not just the accuracy of what she's saying. It's kind of the importance of the weight of what she's saying and the accuracy. So if you're like, well, I lived in this village, and 4 miles outside of the village, there was a river. And the river, next to the river, there was a house. And all of that stuff is accurate. That's a lot more kind of interesting and convincing than just saying, well, I lived in an Irish village and there was a priest and there was a church and there was 3 pubs, like, so when you read the book though, you realize that the details are, there's a tapestry to it as opposed to a list, right? So it's not just, well, she got 5 names out of 7 right, and she got, it's not that. It's kind of it's kind of like, you know, it's explaining Christmas morning versus, the feeling of Christmas morning, or it's explaining like a family dynamic, or it's explaining a village or a town or something like that, where it's more than just the factual data. So it's not just that, oh, there was a Mary and a Michael, but it's like there was a Mary and a Michael, but they were married to, like, and that those relationships are more interest, or are going to be more evidentiary as far as me knowing that this is the town, than just that there was a Mary and a Michael in this town. Mary was married to Tom and had a child named, Sally. Well, that's way more impressive than getting, oh, Mary, Michael, and Sally, knowing the dynamics of that. And so I do encourage people to read the book. The other thing is that they weren't able to pinpoint where she would have gotten this information. Now, I mentioned the Patience Worth case. So, and I'm definitely going to get into that, because the Patience Worth case, as interesting as Bridey Murphy is, the Patience Worth case is more interesting, not more interesting, but there's a further level to it. And just to give everybody a very broad idea of it, Patience
Before
Worth.
we get into Patience Worth, can I just make a comment as somebody who does clinical hypnosis?
Yeah,
and
well,
is
that's
trained?
that's where I wanted to kind of go with
Okay.
this, because the reason why I wanted to do this case in front of the Patience Worth case is, this is what you do. So there is, there are like, there are limitations, and there are things that you understand better
100%.
about this than the casual person would.
I mean, because as you were talking, like, yes, could you inadvertently, or because you're not well trained or properly trained, insert something in somebody's memory or in somebody's mind that feels like a memory because they're in a very hypnotically suggestible state? You absolutely could. Is the way you ask questions important? Yes. Now, remember, when you're doing clinical hypnosis, so a healthcare provider trained to do this in a very controlled setting, there's clinical hypnosis where you absolutely want to create an experience in a person's mind, right? So whether it's pain relief or relaxation or confidence or rehearsal of a procedure they're going to do, that's different from clinical hypnosis to gather information about the origin of a problem, which is more like the Brian White. He would be the more modern day, well-known name, right? And actually, for those who don't know, I can't remember if it was a 5-day or 7-day training with Brian and Carol Weiss, his wife, who's a clinical social worker, years ago. The reason I'm bringing that up, it's been so long since I actually did read about the Bridey Murphy case. Something that would make me think this is a past life and not just fantasy, a creation of her mind, would be, was there anything that bothered her in this life? A fear, a phobia, a pain, bodily pain, that resolved on its own after she had these regression sessions? Because something Brian Weiss will tell you, and you'll read in his books, and I've noticed as well, is that if it's something that is from before now, and I realize it's a controversial thing to say, but I'm going to go with it. We're assuming that past life regression is actually getting at something beyond this life. Does something resolve? And that was my experience actually doing the Brian Weiss training. We can go over that in more detail in another episode, but I had a horrendous fear, like an almost paralyzing fear of the woods that developed probably more in my 20s, to the point where I could barely stay at this retreat center. I mean, I couldn't sleep. And after the regressions that I experienced there, I mean, I live in a somewhat wooded area now, which never would I ever have expected. So I'm curious if this woman experienced other profound changes as a result of doing these sessions. And maybe yes, maybe no, or maybe they wouldn't have made the book. I don't know. And I don't know if you recall. I would have to take a look again.
To
But
be honest with you, I don't recall that that was actually even part of the subject, or part of the discussion of the book. It was almost as if she really became secondary. The Virginia Tighe became she was an she was a secondary character, more of a, you know, it was really more about
Bridey
what
Murphy.
she was relating than why she was relating it. And again, remember, like, and this is what everybody should remember, is that you can't judge this case against what came after it. Right. So this case happens, the book becomes super, super popular. And then all of a sudden, maybe you have a flood of people who are having memories, and oh, they're remembering being Irish, they remember being Romanian or anything like that. The case has to stand on its own merit. It can't be judged by what it caused, right? Because you can judge later cases and say, well, it was because Bridey Murphy, but you can't look at Bridey Murphy and say that, you can't say that its impact like led to what it was, right? So I mean, in
Right.
the book, if I remember correctly, the the reason for the hypnosis and the result of the hypnosis was not really the focus of the book, right? So why she
And
was
that's
going
what I
into
would want to know,
yes,
actually.
why she was
That'd
going
be
into
more
hypnosis.
interesting to me.
So it kind of, and I that's not to say that there weren't subsequent articles that they did discuss that, um, but the book itself, if I remember it correctly, it's been a while since I read it. I don't think, because the book was about Bridey Murphy. It wasn't about
It wasn't about
Virginia Tighe.
Virginia.
Yeah. So, but I mean, but it is interesting, and it's I didn't even realize that. I didn't realize that there was a resolution, that when people did do past life regressions, that they felt a resolution of phenomena or experiences that they were having.
I mean, even in relationships, there are people who, have reported like having incredible animosity toward a family member and vice versa. And they go through these past life regressions. They find the cause. And again, I don't personally care if it's fantasy and their minds have created this story to explain something, or
Right.
if it's real, like a real past life memory. A lot of times I think there are things that are so compelling, I would assume the latter. But, relationships that nothing else works to resolve somehow seem to resolve. Medical issues, crazy stuff.
That's a lot.
Um,
Stevenson talks about that a lot, and Stevenson talks a lot about birthmarks and
yep.
physical manifestations of past lives. I remember a bunch of them where people died violently or with injuries, and a child was born with a physical, with kind of something that was emblematic of that. There's also like, there's a there's some other, there's interesting cases that I think are tangential to reincarnation, where it's not a direct reincarnation, but almost like a visitation of something that, I don't know if it's a past life, but there seems to be some kind of fibrous connection with the past that allows something to enter in. There was a famous case. And I wish I could remember the details, but I don't. Some people would call it a possession case. Some people would call it reincarnation. Some people, but there was a young woman in the Midwest, when she was, I think, 18 years old. No, I think she was 12 years old or so. She essentially disappeared for about 6 weeks, and a young woman disappeared mentally and emotionally. Physically, she was still here. And a young woman from like 100 miles away, who had passed away 10 years before. She'd passed away before this young girl was born, came in and took over her body, and existed, um fully accepted personality, went to live with the parents of the dead girl. They treated her as as their daughter. She remembered every single thing. And this is a very well documented case, but
we have to
she
present
remembered
on this.
she remembered everything about their lives. She remembered everything about her life. And then I think it was 12 weeks that she lived with them. So for 3 months. And at the end of it, she said, okay, I'm okay now. My time is finished. She just the personality is disappeared. And the other girl was like, what am I doing here? Let me go home to my family. So she had lost those 3 months, but, was that reincarnation? Is that possession? Is that, but there was no tie to them. And it is interesting because in a lot of reincarnation cases, particularly in India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia, it's rare that someone reincarnates in the same geographical location, but oftentimes it's close.
Yeah.
Right? Oftentimes it's within like 100 miles or so.
And Kath, I think the term for what you just described with that girl, we have to find the details of that and talk about it in another episode. I think it's called a walk-in, and I have heard of that.
Right. But the interesting thing that was to me about this being a walk-in versus reincarnation is that the young girl who was overtaken was not born when the other when the walk-in died, right? So there was, and I think even Twilight Zone did this as an episode, but I mean, this was a very well documented case, and I apologize for not knowing it. And I'll pull it up. We'll put it in the notes. But there was a question, was this reincarnation? Because because she spontaneously stepped into this girl's life and said, hey, take me to my mother and my father. You're not my mother and my father. And when they visited her, when they brought her to the parents, she knew where her room was. She talked about books that her father and she had read. Like it was a complete understanding, and her parents, both sets of parents, came to accept that that's what had happened. So,
It's crazy.
But it is interesting, right? And a lot of times with the Bridey Murphy case, you're talking about 100 years between one carnation and the other, and a reincarnation, which is, who's to say that 100 years, who's to say there wasn't other, incarnations between that?
Sure.
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 I chose this case because of your knowledge about hypnosis and your knowledge about that.
And it's just
But
a
also,
cool case.
it is a case that it's not an unassailable case, but it's a case that both sides can continue to talk about. And you can continue to talk about this regardless of where you stand. People talk about this, and honestly, it's one of the very few cases that people talk about with respect from both sides, because there is no implication that this was fraud. There is no implication that anyone was attempting to delude anyone else, right? This is purely like, this occurred. What caused it to occur? So what we're arguing here, and the other thing is that this is a paranormal case, absolutely led to a greater understanding of hypnosis, of therapeutic practices, because it led to conversations about that. Right.
Absolutely.
So regardless of whether you think it was one or the other, had this case not happened, the discussion wouldn't have happened.
I think this is a great place to wrap this episode up, but I want to ask our listeners, what do you think? Have you experienced reincarnation? Is this intriguing to you? Are you familiar with the case? What do you think, Kath? Any questions for our listeners?
I mean, reincarnation is not something that sits comfortably in my belief system. It's something that I'm certainly interested in. I definitely think that there's evidence for it. I think Stevenson is very compelling, and to me, it always leads to the cultural import of things, and the acceptance of things, how things are accepted culturally, and how that impacts our belief system. But I've done a lot of seances. I've done a lot of I've been to a lot of readings. I've worked with a lot of people who purport to speak with spirit and other things. And I will say that information comes up in those environments that again, it's not part of my belief system, but that's what's being told and that's what's being said. So I would love to hear what people think. I would love to hear anyone who's had, particularly, I think parents now, certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, are noticing in their children because of a broader acceptance of paranormal phenomena in the United States. I think parents are starting to notice things in their children and paying attention to it. So I would really be interested in hearing from anyone who's seen something in the next generation that has led them to kind of wonder whether or not they're dealing with an old soul.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, thanks for joining us today. We love talking about these things and sharing them with you. And of course, until next time, stay curious.
Keep exploring.
Bye for now.
I know that the paranormal is real. Listen.
You've just listened to the Curious Explorers podcast with the Kathy Kelly and Traci Stein. If you enjoyed the episode, remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment, let us know what you think. And of course, until next time, stay curious.